Black mailman notices stains on elderly white millionaire's pants, looks inside the house and calls 911, and what happened next would forever change the lives of everyone involved. Are you sure it was Mrs. Whitmore's house? The 911 operator's voice carried a thinly veiled disbelief. Because she's one of the biggest donors in town and... Jerome Williams, 34, gripped the phone tighter as he peered through the half-open window of the mansion in Riverside Hill's most exclusive neighborhood. The dark stains he had seen on the elderly woman's pants weren't food or ink. They were blood. And the smell. God, that smell. Yes, ma'am. I need you to send an ambulance to 1847 Maple Street. Now. His voice maintained the professional calm he had developed over 12 years of delivering mail in that neighborhood, where suspicious glances followed him as if he were an intruder disguised as a postal worker. 3 weeks earlier, Jerome had noticed that Mrs. Margaret Whitmore's mail was piling up. The 78-year-old woman, heir to a fortune built on plantations in the last century and now a philanthropist in name only, always insisted on collecting her letters personally. To make sure you're not stealing anything, she had once said, smiling in a way that didn't reach her eyes. But Jerome was different from the other mail carriers who had passed through there. Raised in the poor part of town, the son of a nurse who worked for 20 years caring for neglected elderly people, he recognized the signs when something was wrong. And now, watching Margaret Whitmore stumble over her own furniture as she tried to hide the stains on her clothes, Jerome knew he was dealing with something much worse than a simple fall. You have to understand, the attendant continued, that we're talking about a very respected family. Maybe it would be better to call her private doctor. Jerome closed his eyes for a moment. It was always like this. When it came to people like Margaret Whitmore, rich, white, influential, even the emergency services hesitated. But when it was someone from his community, the sirens arrived in minutes, ready to arrest before they helped. Listen, ma'am. I'm looking at a person in critical condition. If you don't send help now, I'm going to call every newspaper in town and explain how 911 refused to help someone because she's too rich to need help. The silence on the other end of the line was telling. Finally, an ambulance is on its way. Jerome hung up and went back to watching through the window. Margaret had disappeared deeper into the house, but he could hear the sounds of something being dragged. His mailman's mind, trained to notice details that others overlooked, began to piece together a puzzle far more sinister than he had initially imagined. What Jerome didn't know yet was that this call to 911 would not only save a life, it would expose a web of corruption and negligence that reached the highest echelons of the city. And at the center of it all, a truth that would make Jerome question everything he thought he knew about justice, privilege, and the power of one simple person to change an entire system. If you're enjoying discovering how a simple mail delivery can reveal a city's darkest secrets, be sure to subscribe to the channel, because what Jerome was about to discover in that mansion would turn the seemingly ordinary mailman into the man most feared by the powerful of Riverside Hills. The sirens arrived 17 minutes later, enough time for Jerome to observe 3 more neighbors peeking through their curtains, clearly more concerned with the presence of a suspicious black man than with a medical emergency unfolding. A trip that would take only 5 minutes in any other neighborhood in the city. Did you make the call? The chief paramedic, a chubby man in his 50s, looked Jerome up and down with that expression he knew all too well. Are you sure you're not exaggerating? Sometimes people in your profession tend to misinterpret certain situations. Jerome took a deep breath, counting to 3 in his head, a technique his mother, Dorothy, had taught him when he was a child and faced teachers who didn't understand why a kid from the suburbs knew so much about literature. The lady has been in there for at least 3 weeks without proper medical care. There's blood on her clothes and clear signs of medical neglect. The second, younger paramedic headed toward the front door while making low comments to his colleague about mail carriers who think they're detectives. Jerome pretended not to hear, but his fists clenched involuntarily inside his uniform pockets. When they finally entered the mansion, the smell hit them like a solid wall. Margaret Whitmore was lying on the living room floor, surrounded by piles of expired medications, dirty bandages, and clear evidence that she had been unable to care for herself for weeks. Her condition was even worse than Jerome had imagined. My God, murmured the younger paramedic, immediately switching into professional mode. How did she get to this point? As the paramedics worked, Jerome noticed something the others didn't, an open folder on the coffee table, containing medical documents and correspondence that appeared to have been reviewed recently. His mailman's mind, trained to memorize addresses and patterns, automatically registered names and dates. Dr. Richard Pemberton, Private Geriatrician. Riverside Hills Medical Group. The letters were dated 2 months ago, all marked urgent and needs immediate follow-up. Letters that Jerome had delivered personally and that clearly never resulted in medical care. "Hey, Mailman," called the lead paramedic, already carrying Margaret on a stretcher. "You can leave now. We'll take care of it from here." But Jerome didn't move. At 34, the son of a nurse who had spent 2 decades reporting medical negligence against poor elderly people only to be fired for causing trouble, he recognized a pattern when he saw one. Margaret Whitmore wasn't just an elderly woman who had neglected herself. She was a patient abandoned by a system that considered her more valuable dead than alive. "Excuse me," Jerome said, approaching the chief paramedic. "Are you going to investigate why her medical care was discontinued? I've delivered at least a dozen letters from her doctor in the last 2 months." The man stopped and looked at Jerome with growing irritation. "Listen here, kid. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this lady is Margaret Whitmore. She has more money for medical care than you'll ever see in your entire life. If she wasn't getting treatment, she must have her reasons." Jerome felt that familiar burning in his stomach, the same feeling he had felt at 15 when he discovered that his mother Dorothy had been fired from a hospital not for incompetence, but for systematically documenting how black and poor patients received inferior care. The same feeling he had when he realized his mother would never get a job at any hospital in the city again because she had been labeled problematic. "Her reasons," Jerome repeated, his voice maintaining the professional calm he had perfected. "You can't even stand up. What reasons would she have for refusing medical care?" The paramedic approached, lowering his voice to a threatening tone. "Look, kid. I don't know what you're trying to prove here, but I suggest you get back to your deliveries and stop sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. This isn't a neighborhood where people like you should be asking too many questions." It was at that moment that Jerome knew he had stumbled upon something much bigger than simple medical negligence. The excessive defensiveness, the rush to remove him from the scene, the insistence that Margaret had chosen to abandon treatment, it all pointed to a system functioning exactly as it was designed. Jerome watched the ambulance drive away, carrying Margaret to a hospital where, he suspected, she would receive the minimum care necessary to keep her alive, but not necessarily healthy. Meanwhile, he stood at the entrance to the mansion, his mind working like that of a born investigator. What those paramedics didn't know was that Jerome Williams wasn't just a mailman. He was the son of Dorothy Williams, the nurse who had been silenced for exposing the very kind of medical corruption he was now witnessing. And unlike his mother, who had fought alone against an entire system, Jerome had something she never had: access to 12 years of correspondence from all the wealthy families in Riverside Hills. Every medical letter he had delivered, every legal document he had seen, every strange pattern he had noticed over the years, all of it was stored in his meticulous memory. And now, for the first time, he had a reason to use that information. As he walked back to his postal truck, Jerome pulled out his cell phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in 5 years. "Mom? It's me. You need to tell me everything about the case you were investigating before you were fired. I think I've found the tip of the iceberg." What Jerome didn't yet know was that his call to 911 hadn't just saved Margaret Whitmore. It had set in motion an investigation that would uncover a network of systematic medical neglect against wealthy seniors whose inheritances were more valuable than their lives. And at the center of it all, a man whom everyone underestimated was about to become the greatest threat the corrupt medical elite of Riverside Hills had ever faced. "Mom, does the name Dr. Richard Pemberton mean anything to you?" Jerome held the phone as he drove his postal truck through the quiet streets of Riverside Hills, his mind working like a computer connecting information he had gathered over 12 years of delivering mail. Dorothy Williams, 61, had spent the last 5 years working as a private caregiver after being expelled from a hospital system. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had lost an important battle. "Pemberton? Jerome, this man was at the center of everything I was investigating. He ran a scheme where wealthy elderly patients were deliberately neglected to hasten certain estate transitions." "Estate transitions," Jerome repeated, feeling the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "You're talking about inheritance." "I'm talking about legalized murder, son. Influential families paid to have inconvenient relatives cared for until natural death came faster. And when I tried to report it, they painted me as an unbalanced nurse who made up conspiracy theories." Jerome parked in front of Margaret Whitmore's house, staring at the empty windows. His mailman's mind, trained to memorize addresses and patterns, began to mentally review all the medical correspondence he had delivered over the years. "Mom, did you keep any evidence?" "I kept everything, Jerome. Documents, recordings, notes from medical records. It's all in a box in my closet. But alone, I was nothing against an entire system." "But what if you weren't alone this time?" Jerome hung up and immediately dialed another number, one he had found in the phone book Margaret had left open on the table. "Hello, Riverside Hills Gazette? I'd like to speak to the investigative reporter." "Melissa Santos," answered a firm voice on the other end of the line. "Ms. Santos, my name is Jerome Williams. I've been a mailman in this city for 12 years, and I've just uncovered evidence of systematic medical malpractice against wealthy seniors. Would you be interested in a story that could bring down the most corrupt medical scheme in the region?" There was a pause. "Mr. Williams, I get at least 10 calls a week from people alleging medical conspiracies. What makes you different?" "I have access to 12 years of medical correspondence from every wealthy family in town. And I just saved the life of Margaret Whitmore, who was being left to die by the very doctor who swore to protect her." "Margaret Whitmore? The heiress to the Whitmore fortune? Mr. Williams, where can we meet?" 2 hours later, Jerome was sitting in the small-town cafe next to Melissa Santos, a 35-year-old Latina journalist who had built her career exposing corruption in powerful institutions. Between them on the table were stacks of medical letters that Jerome had memorized over the years. "Dr. Pemberton," Jerome pointed to a letter dated 6 months ago, "sent 3 urgent notifications to Margaret about the need for immediate medical intervention. I delivered each one personally. None resulted in care." Melissa studied the documents with the eyes of an experienced investigator. "And you have more cases like this?" "I have 17 families over the last 3 decades where the pattern repeats itself. Wealthy elderly person develops medical condition. Dr. Pemberton takes over care. Medical correspondence ceases abruptly. Patient dies within 6 months. Always natural death. Always with recently altered wills." "Jerome," Melissa said, her voice low but intense, "you're describing a serial murder scheme disguised as geriatric care." At that moment, Jerome's phone rang. It was a number he recognized, Dr. Pemberton's office. "Mr. Williams? This is Dr. Pemberton. I understand you were involved in the incident with Mrs. Whitmore today." Jerome signaled Melissa to activate the recorder on his cell phone. "Yes, doctor. Fortunately, we were able to help in time." "Look," Dr. Pemberton's voice carried a thinly veiled arrogance, "I understand that people in your profession sometimes get too involved with their clients. But I would like you to know that Mrs. Whitmore was under my specialized care. Your interference may have done more harm than good." "Harm?" Jerome kept his voice calm. "She was dehydrated, malnourished, and bleeding. What kind of specialized care includes medical neglect?" "Listen here, young man," Dr. Pemberton's mask of civility began to slip. "I don't know what game you're playing, but I suggest you go back to delivering mail and leave medicine to the qualified professionals. People like you don't understand the complexities of geriatric care." Jerome looked at Melissa, who was furiously writing down every word. "Doctor, are you suggesting that I should have ignored a person in critical condition?" "I'm suggesting that you don't meddle in matters you don't understand. The Whitmore family is very influential, and they are not happy when unsuitable people get involved in their private affairs." The call ended with an abrupt click. Jerome and Melissa looked at each other in silence for a moment. "Jerome," Melissa said finally, "that man just threatened you and confirmed medical malpractice on a recorded call. He's too arrogant to realize he just dug his own grave." "That's exactly what my mother said would happen," Jerome smiled for the first time in hours. "They're so used to no one questioning their authority that they can't imagine someone like me could pose a real threat." Melissa leaned forward. "Jerome, I need you to understand something. If we're right about this, we're not just dealing with a corrupt doctor. We're talking about a scheme involving hospitals, notaries, maybe even judges. These people have enough power to destroy lives." "They've already destroyed lives," Jerome replied, thinking of his mother. "The difference is that this time, they underestimated the wrong person." Jerome pulled out his phone and showed Melissa a digital folder he had created. "For 12 years, I discreetly photographed every suspicious medical letter I delivered. Every strange pattern, every correspondence that stopped abruptly, every family where things didn't add up. I thought I was being paranoid because of my mother's experience. Paranoid? Melissa looked at the amount of methodically organized evidence. Jerome, you're a natural detective who spent a decade documenting crimes without knowing it. And now, Jerome said, his eyes shining with a determination that made Melissa realize she was in the presence of someone extraordinary, it's time to show Dr. Pemberton and his powerful friends what happens when they underestimate a simple mailman who has never forgotten a single letter he delivered. What Dr. Pemberton and the entire corrupt system didn't yet know was that Jerome Williams wasn't just a mailman with a good memory. He was a man who had inherited his mother's investigative courage, now armed with evidence they never imagined anyone was collecting. And unlike Dorothy, who fought alone 5 years ago, Jerome now had an ally with access to the media and enough legal knowledge to turn his silent collection of evidence into the biggest exposé of medical corruption Riverside Hills had ever seen. As Melissa organized the first investigative reports and Jerome planned his next move, neither of them imagined that the true extent of the scheme was even more sinister than they suspected, and that the reaction of the powerful would be more violent and desperate than anything they could have predicted. Melissa Santos's story aired on a Tuesday at 6 p.m., prime time on local television. "Elite doctor accused of murder scheme against wealthy elderly," was the headline flashing across the screen, accompanied by a photo of Dr. Pemberton in his luxurious office. Jerome was at the hospital visiting Margaret Whitmore when all the televisions in the building tuned in to the reports simultaneously. Her recovery had been miraculous. 3 weeks of proper care had reversed months of deliberate neglect. Dr. Richard Pemberton, a renowned geriatrician in Riverside Hills, is under investigation for systematic medical negligence against elderly patients, Melissa announced on the screen. The evidence was provided by Jerome Williams, a mailman for 12 years, who meticulously documented suspicious patterns in medical correspondence. At Dr. Pemberton's office, 17 families of former patients had already gathered in the lobby, some carrying funeral urns of relatives who had died naturally under his care. The receptionist, visibly nervous, tried to explain that the doctor was unavailable, as phones rang incessantly. Jerome watched his mother Dorothy on the screen, being interviewed for the first time in 5 years about her dismissal. "I tried to expose this scheme in 2020, she said with unwavering dignity. "I was silenced and professionally destroyed. But my son did what I couldn't do alone. He had the patience to collect irrefutable evidence." The recording of Dr. Pemberton's call to Jerome was played in its entirety on the air. His arrogant voice echoed through the speakers. "People like you don't understand the complexities of geriatric care, and inadequate people get involved in private business." Every word laden with prejudice and racial superiority was now heard throughout the city. What finally broke Dr. Pemberton was when Melissa revealed the photographs Jerome had discreetly taken of medical correspondence over the years. Urgent letters never answered, patterns of medical neglect, timelines that coincided perfectly with changes to wills, all meticulously organized by a mailman no one had noticed. Margaret Whitmore, still frail but lucid, gave her statement live from a hospital. "Dr. Pemberton told me that my symptoms were normal for my age and that I should accept the natural process. Meanwhile, he charged my family $20,000 a month for care he never provided." The most devastating twist came when the police investigation, forced by public pressure, discovered that Dr. Pemberton had financial partnerships with 5 city notaries and 2 judges who expedited inheritance proceedings. Jerome had delivered correspondence between them for years, unaware that he was documenting a network of corruption that spanned the entire local judicial system. How did a simple mailman expose something that authorities had been investigating for years? Asked a reporter from a rival station during the press conference. Jerome, wearing his clean postal uniform and speaking with the calm he had developed over 12 years of dealing with disrespect, replied, "When you're invisible to powerful people, they do business right in front of you as if you don't exist. I existed. And I remembered." Dr. Pemberton attempted a desperate press conference the next day. Sweating visibly under the camera lights, his arrogance had turned into thinly veiled panic. "This is a coordinated attack on quality private medicine," he stammered. A mailman is not qualified to evaluate complex medical care." "Doctor," interrupted a reporter, "how do you explain 17 families with identical patterns of medical neglect and accelerated death under your care?" That's coincidence. Geriatric patients have limited life expectancies." "What about the recordings where you threaten Jerome Williams and use clearly discriminatory language?" Dr. Pemberton stood up abruptly, knocking over the microphone. "This interview is over." But the cameras continued to roll as he left the hall, his 40-year reputation destroyed in 40 minutes of questions he couldn't answer. 3 days later, the state medical board suspended his license indefinitely. 5 families filed criminal charges. His 2 partners in the practice announced the dissolution of their partnership. The hospital where he held medical privileges canceled his access. In 1 week, Dr. Richard Pemberton went from being a respected physician to a social pariah investigated for serial murder disguised as medical care. Jerome visited Margaret Whitmore on her last day in the hospital. She had almost fully recovered and planned to sue not only Dr. Pemberton, but the entire system that allowed his negligence. "Jerome," she said, holding his hand with surprising strength, "you saved my life. But more than that, you saved how many other lives this man would have destroyed." "I did nothing but pay attention, Mrs. Whitmore. Sometimes that's all that needs to be done." That night, Jerome received a call from Dorothy. "Son, you did in 3 weeks what I tried to do in 20 years of medical practice. How does it feel to be the postman who brought down an entire system of corruption?" Jerome looked out the window of his modest apartment on the outskirts of town, watching the lights of the wealthy part of the city where he had worked for 12 years as if he were invisible. "I feel like I finally understand why you never gave up fighting, Mom. Some battles are worth every scar." What neither of them could have imagined was that Dr. Pemberton's downfall would be just the first domino in an investigation that would uncover corruption in hospitals, registry offices, and courts across 3 neighboring states. Jerome Williams, the mailman everyone underestimated, had set off a chain reaction that would rewrite the laws of geriatric care across the country. While Dr. Pemberton faced his first night in a prison cell, awaiting trial on 17 counts of manslaughter, Jerome planned his next move, because he had discovered evidence in a box of his mother's old papers of an even bigger scheme involving names that would make Pemberton's downfall seem like just the warm-up for the real spectacle of justice that was to come. 6 months later, Jerome Williams was sitting in the front row of the State University's main auditorium, wearing the first suit of his life. The mayor had just announced his appointment as municipal coordinator for the protection of the elderly, a position created specifically after his investigation revealed the extent of medical corruption in the city. Jerome Williams turned 12 years of silent observation into the biggest reform of the geriatric healthcare system our region has ever witnessed, the mayor told reporters. His dedication saved lives and exposed crimes that had remained hidden for decades. In the audience, Dorothy Williams wept with pride as she watched her son receive the Medal of Civil Merit. Beside her, Margaret Whitmore, now fully recovered and an activist for the rights of the elderly, applauded enthusiastically. Dr. Pemberton, meanwhile, was serving his first week of life imprisonment after being convicted of 17 counts of manslaughter and conspiracy. His medical license had been permanently revoked, his assets confiscated to compensate the victims' families, and his 40-year reputation destroyed in a few months of trial. "Doctor," a reporter had asked during his last interview before sentencing, "what do you have to say about Jerome Williams?" Pemberton, visibly aged and broken, merely muttered, "I underestimated someone I shouldn't have underestimated." The scheme Jerome exposed resulted in the arrest of 12 doctors, 5 judges, and 3 notary public owners in 3 states. His methodology of silent documentation was adopted as an investigative model by the FBI, which hired him as a special consultant. Jerome continued his route as a mail carrier for another 3 months, now greeted with respect by the same neighbors who had previously treated him as invisible. "I'd rather finish what I started," he would say when asked why he didn't quit his job immediately. On his last official delivery, Jerome stopped at Margaret Whitmore's house. "I thought you'd like to receive this in person," he said, handing her a letter from the governor announcing the new Margaret Whitmore Act, which mandated quarterly audits of all private geriatric care facilities in the state. "Jerome," Margaret said, "you didn't just save my life. You taught me that justice has no color, social class, or profession. It only has courage." That night, Jerome called his mother. "Mom, we did it. Not just for Margaret, but for all the elderly who will come after her." "Son," Dorothy replied, "you proved that sometimes the most dangerous person to a corrupt system is the one they consider invisible. The best revenge was to show that your intelligence was always greater than their arrogance." Jerome Williams, the mailman no one noticed, had become the man no one could ignore. Dr. Pemberton tried to destroy a life out of prejudice, but ended up handing Jerome the power to save hundreds of other lives. The real revenge was not just exposing Dr. Pemberton, it was building a legacy of protection that would last for generations, proving that silent knowledge, when transformed into courageous action, can rewrite the rules of an entire society. If this story of transformation and justice touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. Have you ever witnessed injustices that seemed impossible to fight? Jerome taught us that sometimes all it takes is one observant and courageous person to change everything.